No one expected what the human did at the Galactic Council. The seat that was not mine. The chamber was already full when I walked in, and nobody looked at me. That was the first thing I noticed. 237 species packed into a room the size of a football stadium, suspended in orbit around a binary star, and not one head turned when the human delegate stepped through the door. No curiosity, no acknowledgement, nothing. I was furniture. I was a potted plant someone had placed in the corner to make the room look complete. My name is Mara Voss. I am 34 years old. I grew up in a small town in northern England, studied political science at university, then spent 11 years working for the Earth Foreign Relations Office before they decided to send me here. Here being the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council, a structure so old that the metal in its bones had been forged before humans had invented the wheel. My title was Observer Delegate, which sounded important until you understood what it actually meant. It meant I had no vote. It meant I had no right to speak unless someone gave me permission. It meant I was supposed to sit in the small curved booth marked with Earth's symbol and watch. I sat down. The booth was made for a species slightly taller than humans, so my feet did not quite touch the floor. I felt like a child at an adult dinner table, which I suspected was not an accident. The chamber itself was extraordinary. I had seen images before arriving, but images do not prepare you for the scale. The ceiling curved upward like the inside of a planet. Every surface was alive with soft light, and the air smelled faintly of something clean and ancient, like rain on stone. Rows of delegate booths spiraled outward from the central speaking platform in wide arcs, each booth shaped to accommodate a different body. Some delegates floated in sealed tanks of amber liquid. Some communicated through light patterns that flickered across their skin. Others sat perfectly still, their minds linked to the chamber systems directly, their physical bodies almost irrelevant. I had a notepad. Paper. I had brought a paper notepad because my supervisor told me the council's signal environment was unpredictable for human devices, and I should not rely on anything electronic. So there I sat, human and small, with a paper notepad, surrounded by 2,000 years of galactic civilization. The session opened without ceremony. The council chair, a being called the first voice of the Keth, was ancient in a way that made the word ancient feel too small. The Keth were the oldest species in the council, 60,000 years of recorded history, and their chair had been alive for more than 800 of those years. She was tall, pale, and almost perfectly still, and when she spoke, her voice came not from her mouth but from somewhere inside the chamber itself, as if the room were speaking. The first item on the agenda was a resource survey update. I wrote that down. The second item was a diplomatic boundary clarification between two species whose names I could not pronounce. I wrote that down too. The third item was the Velhari situation. I stopped writing. I had read the briefing documents on the Velhari 3 times before arriving. They were a species on a planet called Velhar 4, a world in the outer spiral arm, inhabited by approximately 600 million people who had been farming, building cities, and telling stories to each other for about 3,000 years. They had not discovered space travel. They had not made contact with any other species. By every definition the Galactic Council used, they were a pre-contact civilization, which meant they were supposed to be protected under something called the Charter of Developing Worlds. Supposed to be. The Directorate of Elder Races, which was the name given to the block of the oldest and most powerful council members, had filed a motion 3 months ago. Velhar 4, it turned out, contained enormous deposits of a mineral called veridite, which was essential for faster-than-light drive systems. The Directorate's motion proposed reclassifying the planet as an unclaimed resource zone, which would suspend the charter protection and allow mining operations to begin. 600 million people, still on the planet, still living their lives, still completely unaware that anyone was discussing them at all. The first voice announced the agenda item in her calm, ancient voice, and I watched the chamber settle into the practiced rhythm of a decision that had already been made. Delegates shuffled papers, if they had papers. Others transmitted signals to their home systems. A few simply waited with the patience of beings who had lived long enough that waiting felt like breathing. A representative from the directorate rose to present the motion. He was a being called Ambassador Vane, tall and silver-skinned, and he spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who had given this speech many times before, about different planets with different names, and had always won. The Veridite deposits were significant, he said. The Charter of Developing Worlds had a resource exception clause, he said. The Velhari, being pre-contact, had no legal standing before the Council, he said. It was, in his words, a straightforward matter of resource allocation. I wrote every word down. I wrote down the way he said straightforward. I wrote down the way no delegate in the chamber objected. I wrote down the silence, which was the loudest thing in the room. The first voice asked if there were any speakers registered before the vote. No hands, no signals, no one. My notepad was shaking slightly. I looked down at it and realized it was not the notepad. It was my hand. I thought about what I had read. I thought about 600 million people who did not know this meeting was happening. I thought about every briefing document I had memorized, and about the specific rule I had found on page 47 of the Council's procedural charter, the one that said observer delegates could not speak unless the floor was granted to them by a full Council member. I thought about that rule for exactly 4 seconds. Then I stood up. No one had granted me the floor. No one had given me permission. The booth around me was clearly marked as observer status. Every single protocol in the chamber said that what I was doing was not allowed. I stood up anyway, and I said loudly and clearly into that vast and ancient silence, I would like to speak. The chamber turned. Every head, every sensor, every bioluminescent pulse of attention swung in my direction at once. I saw Ambassador Vane blink. I saw younger delegates lean forward. I saw the first voice of the Keth go very, very still, in the way that only very old beings can go still, as if they are deciding whether something is worth their time. Nobody said anything for 3 full seconds, which in a room that size felt like a very long time. Then the protocol droid closest to my booth began to move toward me, and I kept standing, because sitting down was not something I was willing to do. What humans remember. The protocol droid reached my booth in 12 steps. It was a smooth, quiet machine, built by a species I did not know, shaped like nothing familiar, and it placed one arm across the entrance to my booth in a gesture that was polite but absolutely clear. I was to sit. I was to be quiet. I was to remember my place. I looked at it. I looked past it at the chamber, at 237 species, watching a human stand in a seat she had not earned the right to stand in. I understand the procedure, I said, loudly enough that my voice carried without the chamber amplification system, which I did not have access to. I am asking for the floor. That is a request, not a violation. Any delegate may request the floor. The Charter does not exclude observer delegates from requesting. It only prevents us from speaking without permission. So I am asking, who will give it to me? Silence. Then, from the far left arc of the chamber, a sound like deep water moving. The first voice of the Keth raised one pale hand, just slightly, just enough. Under Council law, when a full Council member signals granting of the floor, it cannot be overruled. Not even by the Directorate. Not even by the Chair herself, who was, in this case, the same being doing the granting. Every delegate in the room knew this. Ambassador Vane knew it. I could see it in the way his silver shoulders shifted, a small, tight movement that said clearly that he had not expected this, and he did not like it. The protocol droid stepped back. The chamber amplification connected to my booth with a soft chime, and suddenly, My voice had the full weight of the room behind it. I had 2 minutes. I knew I had 2 minutes because the first voice had held up 2 fingers along with her hand. I did not waste a single second of them. My name is Mara Voss, I said. I represent Earth, which you know as the third planet of a single-star system in the inner spiral arm. We have been members of this council for 11 months. We have no voting rights. We have no speaking privileges. We are, by every measure this institution uses, the newest and least significant species in this chamber. I paused for one breath. I am standing here anyway, because I recognize what is happening, and I am the only delegate in this room who has seen it from the inside. I watched the chamber. I watched beings who had lived for centuries adjust in their seats. I had their attention, which was the only weapon I had, and I intended to use it carefully. The Velhari are a species of 600 million people, I said. They live on a planet rich in a mineral that other, more powerful species want. They cannot speak for themselves in this chamber because they do not know this chamber exists. And the motion before this council today proposes to reclassify their home world as an unclaimed resource zone, which is a very clean phrase for something much older and much uglier. Ambassador Vane made a sound. The first voice did not look at him. I am not going to tell you that this is wrong, I said. I am going to tell you something more useful. I am going to tell you that Earth did this. Not to another species, to ourselves. For 400 years, human nations crossed oceans and found other human beings with less technology, less military power, and less access to global institutions. And we called their lands unclaimed. We called their resources unallocated. We used very clean language to justify taking everything they had, and we told ourselves we were doing something reasonable. The chamber was perfectly still. I am not standing here to ask for your sympathy for those events, I said. I am standing here because humans are the only species in this room who have been both sides of this transaction. We were the Directorate, and we were the Velhari, and we know, with the specific and painful knowledge of hard experience, exactly what this vote means and exactly what it will produce. I looked directly at Ambassador Vane. It will not produce clean resource extraction. It will not produce an orderly reallocation of minerals. It will produce 600 million people who wake up one day to discover that beings from the sky have decided their world belongs to someone else. And every single thing that follows from that moment, the fear, the resistance, the eventual collapse of everything they have built, none of that will appear in any council report. It never does. It didn't in ours either. I had 30 seconds left. I could feel it. I am not asking you to protect the Velhari because it is kind, I said. I am asking you to consider that this council has done this before, 14 times by my count, since the Charter of Developing Worlds was signed. And I am asking you to look at the record of what followed each of those 14 decisions and tell me honestly that the outcome was worth calling straightforward. The chime sounded. My 2 minutes were done. I sat down. Nobody moved for a long moment. The chamber sat in the kind of silence that follows something unexpected, not shocked exactly, but recalibrating. I could hear my own heartbeat. I could feel the weight of every eye in that room still resting on my booth. Then Ambassador Vane cleared his throat and asked the first voice to proceed with the vote. And the first voice said in her ancient, room-filling voice, "The vote is postponed." The chamber erupted. Not loudly, not the way a human crowd erupts, but in the way that beings of 100 different languages and body types register shock simultaneously. Signals fired across the chamber network. Delegates turned to each other. The Directorate's side of the room went rigid with controlled outrage. I sat in my small booth with my paper notepad and wrote down 2 words. Vote postponed. Then I wrote a third word, a question to myself that I underlined twice. Now what? Because I had bought time. I had bought exactly that, nothing more. The postponement was not a victory. It was a pause, and a pause only mattered if you could fill it with something. I had one night to figure out what that something was. I did not sleep. I sat in my assigned quarters aboard the station, a small room with a window that looked out at the binary stars, and I went through every document I had brought with me. My briefing files, Earth's trade law archives, the Council's own procedural charter, historical records of previous resource motions and how they had been challenged or upheld. I was looking for a gap, not a loophole, not a trick, but a genuine structural space in Council law where a different answer could fit. Because I had said what humans knew. Now I needed to show what humans had learned to do about it. I found something at 3 in the morning, station time, buried in a footnote on page 112 of the Charter Amendment records from 400 years ago. A species called the Marin had proposed a cooperative resource development framework before the Directorate had voted them down. The framework had never been adopted, but it had never been formally struck from the record either. It was still there, dormant, like a seed that had never been planted. I read it 4 times. Then I opened a new page in my notepad and started writing. By morning, I had the bones of something, not a speech, not an objection, a proposal, a countermotion, a framework for how the Velhari situation could be resolved without the Directorate simply taking what it wanted. I called it the Velhari Compact. I had no idea if it would work. I had no idea if anyone would listen. I was an observer delegate with no vote, no staff, no political capital, and a paper notepad. But I had stood up the day before in a room full of ancient beings and said something true, and the oldest being in that room had given me the floor, and that meant something. I did not know exactly what, not yet, but something. I put on my jacket and walked back into the corridors of the station. The real work was about to begin. The Compact. The corridors of the Galactic Council station were not designed for walking. They were designed for the species that had built them, beings who moved in patterns and rhythms that did not match human stride, and so the hallways curved at odd angles and the lighting shifted in spectrums that made my eyes work harder than usual. I had been on the station for 3 days, and I still got turned around every time I left my quarters. But I walked anyway because that was what I had. No staff, no appointments, no access to the formal diplomatic network that most delegates used to arrange meetings. What I had was my feet and my notepad and the fact that I had said something in that chamber that people were still thinking about. The first delegate I found who would talk to me was a being called Pell, a junior representative from a mid-tier species called the Draven. The Draven were small and quick, covered in fine gray fur, and they communicated partly through spoken language and partly through a rapid system of ear and tail positions that I could not read at all. Pell found me in one of the station's common areas, where different species came to consume nutrients in their various ways, and sat down across from me without being invited. "You are the human," Pell said. "I am," I said. "You spoke without the floor, and then the first voice gave it to you." "Yes." Pell's ears moved in a pattern I could not interpret. That has not happened in my species' recorded history of council proceedings. The observer booth has been there for 1,200 years. No one has ever stood up from it uninvited. "No one from Earth has been here before," I said. "We didn't know we weren't supposed to." That was not entirely true, but it was close enough. Pell tilted its head. "The Draven have voted with the Directorate on resource motions for 60 years, it said. Not because we agree, because we have 17 colony systems and the Directorate controls the trade routes that connect them. If we vote against the Directorate, our colonies experience supply delays. It has happened before. It was not subtle." I wrote that down. "How many species are in a similar position?" I asked. "Most of the mid-tier block," Pell said. 30 to 40 delegates depending on the motion. The Directorate does not need to threaten openly. The structure does the work." I looked at my notepad. What if the structure changed? Pell looked at me for a moment. Humans have been in space for how long? 212 years, I said. In council for 11 months. And you believe you can change the structure of the Galactic Council in the time before the vote is rescheduled. I believe I can propose something that makes it easier for 30 to 40 delegates to vote differently than they have been voting, I said. I don't need to change the whole structure. I just need to give people a reason to choose differently this time. Pell's tail moved. Show me what you have, it said. I opened my notepad to the pages I had written overnight and slid it across the table. Pell read slowly. The chamber around us continued its quiet hum of activity. Other delegates passed through. A Keth Jr. representative paused near our table, glanced at the notepad, and then kept walking, but slowly, in the way of someone who wanted to appear uninterested but was not. The Cooperative Resource Compact, Pell said after a while. The Velhari are uplifted to junior council status, mining proceeds under a joint agreement. Revenue is shared with the Velhari people through a managed development fund. In exchange, Velhar 4 becomes a protected territory with full charter rights. Yes, I said. The Directorate receives the Veridite, Pell said. Most of it, I said. Enough to satisfy the practical need. The motion was always about the mineral, not about the Velhari specifically. If the mineral can be obtained without the Directorate needing to reclassify the planet, the core argument for the motion disappears. Pell was quiet for a moment. You are offering them what they want. I am offering everyone a way to get something, I said. The Directorate gets access to the Veridite. The mid-tier block gets a precedent that limits the resource exception clause for the future. The Velhari get protected status and a development fund. And the Council gets to make a decision that it does not have to be embarrassed about in 400 years when someone is looking through the records. Pell set the notepad down. The Directorate will oppose it. Of course, I said. But if I can show them that the votes are not there for the original motion, they may decide a partial win is better than a failed vote. The Directorate has not lost a resource motion in 800 years. They will not want to lose this one on record. You are using their pride as leverage, Pell said. I am using their preference for winning quietly, I said, which is the same thing. Pell's ears moved again. This time I thought it might be something like amusement, though I could not be sure. I will speak to 3 colleagues, it said. I cannot promise anything, but I will speak to them. That is all I am asking, I said. Pell left. I sat alone with my notepad and my now cold cup of something the station's nutrition system had interpreted as tea, which tasted nothing like tea but was warm, and I looked at the 12 pages of handwritten notes I had produced overnight and thought about what came next. What came next was harder than finding Pell. What came next was navigating the corridors for the rest of the day, approaching delegates from species I had only read about, introducing myself as the human who had stood up in the observer booth, and asking for 15 minutes of their time. Most of them gave it to me. Some of them turned away. A few looked at me the way you look at something you do not quite know how to categorize. One of them, a delegate from a species called the Veth, a tall, four-armed being named Orin who represented a system of 9 inhabited worlds, sat with me for an hour. Orin had been on the council for 40 years and had voted with the Directorate 68 times. I have not voted against them because I could not afford to, Orin said flatly, which I appreciated. Your compact changes that if the numbers are real. The numbers are real, I said. I pulled them from the council's own economic survey archives. You had one night, Orin said. I did not sleep, I said. Orin looked at me for a long moment. Humans, it said, not as an insult, not as a compliment, but as a statement of something it was still processing. We tend to work fast when it matters, I said. Why does this matter to you? Orin asked. Earth is new. Your species has nothing to gain from this politically. You have no trade relationships with the Velhari. You have no history with the Directorate. This is not your fight." I thought about how to answer that honestly. "We spent 400 years doing exactly what the Directorate is doing now," I said, "on a smaller scale to our own people. And when we finally stopped, we spent the next 200 years trying to understand why we had started in the first place and what it had cost, and whether we could build something that would not repeat it. That work is not finished. It will not be finished in my lifetime." But when I walked into that chamber and heard the motion being presented, I recognized every word of it. I have read those words in our own history. I know what comes after them. Oren was quiet. "So yes," I said, "it is not my fight in the political sense, but I am the only delegate in this room who knows what losing this fight looks like from the ground. And I am not willing to watch it happen and say nothing just because my booth is marked observer." Oren leaned back. "I will support the compact," it said, "and I will bring 2 others." By the time I returned to my quarters that evening, I had spoken to 22 delegates. 11 had committed to support the compact. 4 had said they would consider it. 7 had declined. And later that night, as I was reviewing my notes, a message arrived through the station's diplomatic communication system. It was from a junior aide in the First Voice's office, and it contained no words, only a time. The following morning early. An invitation to meet with the Keth Elder directly. I sat with that for a long time. The Keth Elder had been alive for 800 years. She had seen civilizations rise and collapse. She had watched species reach space for the first time and then tear themselves apart before they ever left their home system. She had seen the council built into what it was, and she had seen what it had refused to become. I wrote down everything I wanted to say to her, then crossed most of it out. When I arrived the next morning, the elder's chamber was small and very quiet. She sat across from me like a piece of very old architecture, unhurried, permanent. She said, "We have been watching species reach space for 60,000 years. You are the first to arrive already knowing what not to do." I did not tell her how much it cost us to learn that. Some things you keep. Instead, I placed my compact on the table between us, and we talked for 2 hours, and when I left, I knew that the vote, when it came, would be different from anything this council had seen in a very long time. I did not know yet if different would be enough. The vote. The morning of the re-vote, I woke before the station's light system shifted to its daytime setting. I lay in the narrow bed in my small room and looked at the binary stars through the window, 2 suns rising together in a system that had never had a planet humans could live on, and I thought about everything I had not been able to control. I had spent 3 weeks working the corridors, the common areas, the quiet corners of the station where delegates went when they did not want to be seen having conversations. I had spoken to 61 delegates in total. I had presented the Velhari Compact to every mid-tier block member who would sit with me. I had answered questions, revised projections, and rewritten the economic framework 3 times based on objections I had not anticipated. And the Directorate had been busy too. I knew this because Pell told me, bluntly and without softening it, 2 days before the vote. The Directorate had called in favors. They had reminded mid-tier species of the supply route arrangements. They had framed the compact as an overreach by a species that had been in space for 200 years and in the council for less than 12 months. Some delegates who had committed to supporting the compact had quietly withdrawn their support. One had stopped returning my messages entirely. I had gone to bed the night before the vote not knowing if I had enough. I got up, I put on my jacket, I walked to the chamber. The session was the most attended council meeting in 3 centuries, according to the station's press system. Every species with observation access was watching. Delegate booths that were sometimes half empty were full to capacity. Alien media systems I did not recognize had positioned themselves at approved recording angles. The chamber felt different, heavier. charged with the awareness that something that had not been uncertain for a very long time was now genuinely uncertain. I sat in my observer booth. The first voice opened the session without looking at me, which was fine. I was not here for acknowledgement. I was here for the vote. The directorate went first. Ambassador Vane presented the original motion again, tightened and refined from 3 weeks of preparation. He was calm and precise, and he made the case sound reasonable, the way a case always sounds when it is presented by someone who has absolute confidence in the outcome. He cited the resource survey. He cited the charter exception clause. He cited 14 previous decisions that had followed the same framework and produced, in his words, orderly and beneficial outcomes for council development. I wrote that phrase down, orderly and beneficial. Then I was given the floor, officially this time. The first voice announced it with full protocol, not 2 minutes, no time limit stated. The chamber was mine for as long as I needed. I stood up. I did not bring notes. I had spent 3 weeks reading, writing, revising, preparing. Everything I needed was in my head. I wanted to be looking at the room, not at paper. I want to start with something simple, I said. Every civilization in this chamber was once a civilization that could not speak for itself before a body like this. Every species here had a moment in its history when it was developing, when it was young, when it had not yet reached the stars, and when everything it had built on its home world was entirely dependent on whether more powerful beings outside its reach decided to leave it alone. I looked around the room. I am not saying this to lecture you. I am saying this because I believe this council was built on the memory of that moment. The Charter of Developing Worlds was not written because the founders of this institution were feeling generous. It was written because they remembered what it felt like to be unprotected, and they decided that something should exist to prevent it from happening again. I paused. The Directorate has presented this motion as a straightforward resource allocation. I want to present it as something else. I want to present it as a test of what this institution is actually for. Ambassador Vane made a sound. The first voice did not look at him. 3 weeks ago I tabled a counter-proposal, I said. The Velhari Compact. I am not going to summarize it again because every delegate in this room has read it. I want instead to address the argument that has been made against it most frequently in the corridors of this station over the past 3 weeks. I let that sit for a moment. I watched a few delegates shift in their seats. They knew what was coming because they had made the argument to me directly. The argument is this: Earth is new. Earth has been in space for 200 years and in this council for 11 months. Earth has no standing to propose structural changes to how the council handles resource motions. Earth should observe and learn before it speaks. I nodded. That is a fair argument in ordinary circumstances, and I want to address it directly. I reached into my jacket pocket and removed a data chip. I held it up. This chip contains 400 years of Earth's own classified historical archives. Our records of resource exploitation, of what we called at the time orderly and beneficial development of territories we had decided were unclaimed. It contains population data, economic records, long-term outcome analyses conducted over centuries. It contains, in short, the most complete record that any species in this chamber has ever compiled of what this kind of decision actually produces over the following 200 years. The chamber was very quiet. I am submitting this as formal evidence to the council record, not because I want your sympathy for what my species did, but because I want to be precise about something. Earth does not lack standing to speak on this issue because we are new to space. Earth has standing to speak on this issue because we are the only species in this room that has ever conducted this exact experiment, documented every stage of it, and lived with the results long enough to know what the record shows. I set the chip on the edge of my booth, where the chamber systems would log it formally. The record shows that what you call resource reallocation produces short-term mineral extraction and long-term civilizational damage, not to the extracting species, to the extracted one. The Velhari, if this motion passes, will not simply lose access to their mineral deposits. They will spend the next 4 generations trying to understand what happened to them, building resentment and instability, and eventually they will reach space angry. And when they do, they will remember this vote. I looked at the Directorate block. The Velhari Compact does not prevent the Directorate from obtaining the Veridite they need. It changes the method. It costs more time and requires cooperation. It produces a slower result. But it produces a result that does not require this council, 4 centuries from now, to spend a session explaining why another developing species emerged from contact with galactic civilization damaged and hostile. I let that land. I am not asking you to be generous, I said. I am asking you to be accurate. The motion before you today is not straightforward. It never has been. The language around it is straightforward. The consequences are not. And I believe this council knows the difference, because the Charter of Developing Worlds would not exist if the founders of this institution did not understand that difference themselves. I looked at the first voice. I believe this council was built to be better than the available precedent. I am asking it to be that today. I sat down. The chamber was still. Then the vote began. Mid-tier delegates transmitted their choices through the chamber network. The display above the central platform began to fill. I did not look at it. I looked at Pell's booth, which was on the far left arc, and I watched Pell transmit a vote, and I saw the direction of it from the color shift in the display, green for the compact, amber for the original motion. Pell voted green. Oren voted green. The Directorate block voted amber, every member as expected. The numbers built. I watched the display and did the math in my head, and for a long stretch of time the amber held more points than the green, and I sat very still in my booth and breathed carefully. Then 3 votes came in from a species called the Seven, whose home world had been in a resource dispute with a Directorate member 40 years ago and had never forgotten it, and all 3 were green. Then a species I had not spoken to, a collective called the Norin, submitted a block vote through their unified mind system. Green. I had not reached the Norin. I did not know why they were voting for the compact. I would find out later from Pell that the Norin had been watching the 3 weeks of corridor conversations through the station's shared network access, which their collective consciousness could observe passively, and they had made their own decision. The display shifted. Green passed amber. The compact won by a margin of 11 votes, not large, not comfortable, 11 votes out of more than 200. But it won. The chamber did not erupt the way I had imagined it might. It settled, like something finding a new position after being moved. There were signals and sounds I could not fully read, but the dominant quality of the room in the moments after the vote was something close to adjustment. A large, ancient thing had shifted, and everyone was determining what that meant. Ambassador Vane looked at me from across the chamber. His expression was controlled. He was not finished. I knew he was not finished, but for today, on this vote, on this record, he had lost. I wrote the result in my notepad. Compact adopted, 11 margin. Then I wrote one more word beneath it. Begin. Because the vote was not the end. The vote was the start of the actual work, the implementation, the oversight, the years of negotiation ahead. I had no illusions about that. When the session closed, Ambassador Vane crossed the chamber floor. He moved slowly, with the ease of something that has existed for so long that urgency is no longer a feeling it bothers with. He stopped in front of my booth. "You have made enemies today, human," he said. I nodded. "We are used to that," I said. "We usually make them right before we make history." He looked at me for a moment, then he turned and walked away. I sat in my booth until the chamber emptied, and then I sat a little longer, alone in the quiet of a room that had just done something it had not done in 800 years. I looked at my notepad. 12 pages of handwritten preparation, a data chip of 400 years of human record, and 11 votes. I thought about every person I had spoken to on Earth before leaving. My supervisor, who had given me the briefing documents and told me to observe and learn. My colleague Owen, who had shaken my hand at departure and told me not to embarrass the planet. My old professor, Diane, who had called me the morning I left and said, "You are going to a room full of people who have been doing this for a very long time. Do not let them convince you that the way they do it is the only way it can be done." I thought about Diane. Then I closed my notepad and walked out into the corridor, and I started figuring out what to do next. What we brought with us. I landed back on Earth on a Tuesday afternoon. It was raining, which was appropriate, because it almost always rained in the part of northern England where I had grown up and where my parents still lived. My mother had made tea, the real kind, and she pressed a cup into my hands before I had even put my bag down. And for a few minutes I just sat in her kitchen with the rain against the window and drank tea and did not think about anything galactic at all. That lasted about 40 minutes, which was how long it took for the first official message to arrive on my phone from the Earth Foreign Relations Office, asking when I would be available for a full debrief. I told them Thursday. They said Tuesday night. We settled on Wednesday morning. The debrief lasted 8 hours. Then there was a government briefing. Then there was a press inquiry that my supervisor handled on my behalf because I had asked to avoid cameras for a few days. Then there was a request from a university who wanted me to speak at a conference on interspecies diplomacy, which I declined, and another from a publishing house who wanted me to write a book, which I also declined, and a very long letter from a school in Australia where a class of 12-year-olds had followed the council vote through the public broadcast feed and wanted to ask me questions, which I accepted, because 12-year-olds ask better questions than anyone. A girl named Lucy asked me why I had stood up when I was not supposed to. I thought about that for a moment. Because being quiet when something wrong is happening is also a choice, I said, and I wanted to make a different one. A boy named George asked if the aliens were scary. Some of them were very large, I said, and very old, but no, they were not scary. They were just different, and differences are only frightening until you look at them long enough. A girl named Faye asked if I was going back. Yes, I said, there is a lot of work still to do. That was more true than I could explain to a room full of 12-year-olds. The compact had been adopted, but adoption was a beginning, not an ending. The Velhari Compact required an implementation committee, which had to be formed, chaired, and funded. It required a framework for uplifting the Velhari to junior council status without disrupting a civilization that still did not know any of this was happening. It required, at some point, a first contact mission, which would be the most delicate diplomatic event in the Velhari's entire history. The Directorate had accepted the result of the vote without formally contesting it, which was the correct legal response to a lost motion. But acceptance and agreement are different things, and I did not expect the Directorate to be quiet for long. There were other planets with other resources and other precontact species, and the Charter Exception Clause was still in the law, and 11 votes was not a permanent majority. I thought about all of this during the weeks I spent on Earth, in meetings and briefings and quiet evenings at my parents' house with the rain and the tea. I thought about the work ahead and the opposition it would face, and the long, slow difficulty of making something good hold long enough to become permanent. One evening my father, who is a retired school teacher and has no interest in politics but a great deal of interest in people, asked me what it had actually been like. Not the vote, not the council, not the diplomatic mechanics. What it had been like personally to be in that room. I was quiet for a moment. It was like being the youngest person at a table where everyone else had been meeting together for a very long time, I said. They had their ways of doing things, their rhythms, their unspoken agreements about what was and wasn't done. And I walked in and did something that wasn't done, and I thought maybe that was precisely because I was the only one there who didn't know it wasn't done. My father thought about that. Was it frightening? He asked. After, I said, during there wasn't time. He nodded. That's usually how it works, he said, and went back to his book. I returned to the station 6 weeks after the vote. The implementation committee had been formed. It included 3 directorate members, 4 mid-tier delegates including Oren, 2 Keth representatives, and me, still technically an observer but now serving in a working capacity that the first voice had arranged through a procedural accommodation that no one was going to contest publicly. The work was slow. It was detailed and complicated and full of arguments about mineral extraction rates and development fund management structures, and the specific legal language required to bring a per-contact species into protected charter status without any member of that species knowing it was happening. There were meetings that lasted 12 hours and produced 2 paragraphs of agreed text. There were sessions where the directorate representatives raised procedural objections that required 3 days of research to answer. There were moments when I thought the whole thing would stall, that the weight of institutional resistance would grind it to a stop before it ever produced anything real. But it did not stop. It moved, slowly, unevenly, with the grinding quality of any large thing being redirected, but it moved. And 4 months after the vote, I was in the committee chamber reviewing a draft of the Velhari protection framework when an aide came to the door and told me that a ship had just docked. The first Velhari delegation had arrived. I had known they were coming. The first contact mission had been conducted 6 weeks earlier, a careful, extended process managed by a team of specialists from 7 different species. The Velhari had been extraordinary about it, which was the word the mission lead had used in the report, extraordinary, meaning they had asked 10,000 questions and absorbed the answers with a speed and intensity that had surprised everyone involved. They had asked to send a delegation to the council immediately. Their government, a council of elected representatives from 14 regional bodies, had convened within 48 hours of first contact, voted to accept observer status, and begun preparing their first diplomatic team. 6 weeks later, they were here. I walked down to the docking level. There were 9 of them, the Velhari delegates, and they were humanoid in a way that I had not expected, but that somehow made sense given everything. 2 legs, 2 arms, bilateral symmetry, faces configured in the general pattern that produces eyes and a mouth. They were taller than humans, pale gold in skin tone, and they moved with a careful precision that I recognized as the specific quality of people who are trying very hard not to appear as overwhelmed as they feel. Their lead delegate was named Sail. She was younger than I had expected, perhaps 30 by human reckoning, with clear eyes and an expression that suggested she had been chosen not for her age or her rank, but for her ability to walk into a completely unknown situation and remain functional. She looked at me. "You are the human," she said, in Galactic Standard, which she had apparently learned in the 6 weeks since first contact. Not perfectly, but clearly. The one who spoke. "Yes," I said. "My name is Mara Voss." "I watched the recording," Sale said. "They gave us access to the council archive. I watched the session 3 times." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "Your species has been here for less than a year. You had nothing to gain. The political cost to your delegation must have been considerable." I thought about how to answer that. I had answered versions of it before, to Pell, to Oren, to my father. But standing in front of Sale, who had grown up on a planet that had not known the galaxy existed, who had learned in 6 weeks that the world she lived in was much larger and more complicated than anyone on her world had imagined, and who had somehow walked calmly onto a station, orbiting a binary star to represent 600 million people who were still trying to absorb the news. I felt that any answer I gave needed to be precise. My species spent a long time doing to other people what the Directorate tried to do to yours, I said. Not in space, on our own world. We called it by different names at different times, but it was the same action, taking what belonged to someone else because they could not stop us. Sale was listening. And we have spent the last 200 years trying to understand that period of our history clearly enough to not repeat it, I said. Not successfully, not completely, that work is still going, but we have tried. And when I walked into that chamber and heard the language being used about your world, I recognized it. I had read it in our own archives. I knew what came next. What does come next? Sale asked. In your history, what came after? I thought about how to say this honestly. A very long argument, I said, about what we had done and what it meant and who was responsible and what could be repaired and what could not. A great deal of pain, a great deal of anger that was completely fair and justified, and eventually, slowly, a decision by enough people in enough places that doing it again was not acceptable, not because it became impossible, because enough people chose not to. Sale was quiet for a moment. Did it work? She asked. I had heard that question somewhere before. Not here, not from Sale, but from myself, in the quiet moments at night when I lay in my small room and thought about what I was actually doing and whether it was enough. Did it work? Would it hold? Was 11 votes on one motion in one session enough to be the beginning of something real? Or was it a single moment of deviation in a system designed to return to its old shape? I thought about the implementation committee, still meeting, still arguing, still producing slow paragraphs of agreed text. I thought about the Velhari Compact sitting in the council record as formal adopted policy. I thought about Orin and Pell and the Norin block and the 11 votes, and about the first voice of the Keth giving me the floor with 2 fingers and 800 years of patience behind them. I thought about my father's kitchen and the rain and the 12-year-olds who had watched a council vote through a public broadcast feed and sent questions. I thought about the fact that Sale was standing in front of me, real and present, and asking good questions in Galactic Standard. She had learned in 6 weeks, representing 600 million people who now knew the galaxy existed, and had sent their youngest and sharpest person to figure out what to do about it. I looked out at the station corridor, at the curve of it disappearing into distance, at the other delegates moving through it from their 100 different places. We are here, I said, both of us. That is the answer for today. Sale looked at me. Then she looked at the corridor. Then she looked back at me with the expression of someone who has just made a decision. Show me where to begin, she said. I picked up my notepad. Follow me, I said. We walked together into the station, into the work, into the long and complicated future that does not arrive clean or certain but arrives anyway, one step and one vote and one chosen word at a time. I did not know how it would go. I had never known. But I had learned, slowly and at some cost, that not knowing was not the same as not going. We went. Stars outside the station windows held their light across distances so vast that the light itself was old by the time it arrived, and I thought, as I often did in quiet moments, about how strange it was to be a human being in a place like this. Young species, new voice, short history by galactic measure, carrying 200 years of space travel and 400 years of hard lessons and several thousand years of stories about what people do to each other when they forget that everyone is someone. We carried all of it with us, the good and the bad and the unresolved and the ongoing. We carried it into a room full of ancient beings, and we spoke when we were not supposed to, and something shifted. It was not enough by itself. It would never be enough by itself. But it was a start, which was the only thing a start could ever be, and we had made it, and now the work was to make it hold. That work did not end when I walked out of the chamber. It did not end when the vote was counted. It did not end when the Velhari delegation arrived, or when the compact moved into implementation, or when I stood in my parents' kitchen drinking tea while the rain came down. It was still going. It will still be going long after my name is a footnote in a very long record. But footnotes matter. They are where the real information lives, the qualifications, the complications, the things that did not fit in the main text but were true anyway. I am comfortable being a footnote. I picked up my notepad. I followed Sale. We walked toward the committee rooms where the slow, detailed, necessary work was waiting. It was enough. It was a beginning. We went.